particularly died by hanging. They would just hang themselves because they thought it was not worth continuing. Okay? Obviously, because it was an economic venture, if there was any suspicion that someone was going to commit suicide, that person was prevented from doing so as much as possible, because someone who committed suicide was a loss to the master. So they tried to keep them alive, beat them as much as possible to get as much work out of them. And as a result, we have what my term is, I don't know a good way to express it in English, so I call it psychological marooning. I don't know, marronnage psychologique. Ways of escape in order to survive. You know, if you have problems, some people sing, some people meditate, some people do all sorts of things to keep themselves from being really mentally ill. And so under these types of circumstances, those who didn't commit suicide decided to take refuge in songs, dances, stories. Most of these were part of their cultural heritage that they had brought from Africa. What was interesting was that when the slaves were brought, in order to avoid them getting together in little cliques and having insurrections, they separated them. So your group wasn't put in this village and the other group in that village. No, they mixed them up, so they made certain you had no common language, but they couldn't prevent you from having common cultures, because right across sub-Saharan Africa, even though the languages were different, the cultures were similar, and so there would be certain types of activities that they would share in order to communicate. And eventually that became part of the Creole culture. I'll come back to that. But back to the métissage at the top there. Métissage, I prefer to use the word métissage because somehow I looked in the dictionary and it said interbreeding. And I have a problem psychologically with thinking about breeding human beings, interbreeding. And they said when it's animals, it's crossbreeding. So I thought I'd just give you that in parentheses so you understand what I mean by métissage. Métissage is bringing two different races together and producing children. So that's métissage. And that's métissage with regard to people. Okay, as I said, the slave masters were often unaccompanied by their wives, okay, and so that's what happened. What is interesting is that these children who came as a result of these relationships were not recognized. They were not reconnus. The fathers couldn't I mean, if you were a white slave master, you could not admit to having, you know, enfant bâtard. You couldn't admit to having these illegitimate children, okay? And so these children were there. They were born slaves. Even though their fathers were the masters, they were born slaves. Sometimes some of them were honored. Some generous fathers invited them to work in the house, in the kitchen, serve meals, clean. That was a big privilege compared to having to go out from very young to work from dawn to dusk under the sun, the heat of the tropical sun. That was quite a privilege. So if you were lucky to have been born a métis, then, and you had a generous father who wouldn't claim you as his child, but would allow you to work in the kitchen, then you were very lucky. It was a big privilege. Okay? And so back to the Creole culture at the bottom, the result of this métissage was the birth of Creole children. Okay? Creole, I want to explain this story because people here, because they think of Creole from Louisiana and so forth, think that Creole is one thing. Creole is just a phenomenon, and it occurs in any place where you've had mixtures of cultures. So there's no one Creole. Okay, every so often I get a call from the school system, Stevens Point school system, saying a child has been adopted from Haiti who doesn't speak any English or French. Can you come and speak Creole? And I say, really, I would like to help, and they don't believe that I know one or two words, but that would help no one. Okay, I am a Creole speaker of a different kind. Okay, and so there's Creole and Creole. Creole just means a mixing, and it tends to come a lot from places that were former colonies. Okay, so it's generic. In the case of Guadeloupe, the Creole culture that had the African roots from the slave population, the French, and then after abolition, they needed to replace the manpower for the plantations. And so they started importing, not in the same massive amounts as with the slaves, importing smaller numbers, but people from India to replace the slave labor. That didn't work out because just at the same time, beet sugar started to become popular, and therefore there was a little sagging in the demand for cane sugar, etc., etc. So it didn't last very long. However, having come to the Caribbean, they couldn't possibly go back home. There was no way. I mean, at that time, you couldn't hop on a plane and get back to India. You were there, and so they stayed. What is interesting now, I'm not going to talk much about this because I want to get to my actual research. There's still an Indian, as in the sense of from India, population in Guadeloupe. I recently saw a Hindu temple and of course tried to get in. There was no way. The barrier was extremely high, and it was very clear that only members of that. They live in a very tight community. Occasionally you'd see one or two at the supermarket or so forth, but they marry their own, they work with their own, they do not really mix. They live in a closed society. Okay, so well, that's so much about Creole culture. Okay, this culture is hybrid. As I say, it has the French language, okay, currency, it's the euro if you're in Guadeloupe. The food, you could have regular baguette or whatever you want in the morning, just like you're in France. Education system, totally French. Everything right through to university. Exactly. It is part of France. But on the other hand, you have the Creole culture, you have the Creole language, and because each Creole is different, there's Martinican Creole, Dominican Creole, Haitian Creole, Guyanese Creole, etc. The food is wonderful. That's where the Creole culture really is very rich. Later on you could probably look, there's some recipes that are on the back, very wonderful food. The music, I'll just play something very quickly from one of my favorite groups, and this is a special edition, their 20-year anniversary, and this was given to me by my friend who's the godmother of the leader of the band, and it was only one of a kind, so I'm very very happy to have it and would let no one touch it except Mark. And so I'll just let you listen very closely, because we're accustomed to hearing very rhythmic music from the Caribbean, and that is true. There's a lot of that, but there are other things. So that's more of a stereotype, and part of what I like to do is break some stereotypes. So this is something else, partly rhythmic, but you'll hear. See if you can understand Creole, a little bit of Creole. Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Zut alors.
Zut alors. Zut alors, mais bravo Eleanor, zut alors. C'est pas grave. Oh, it'll start all over, so never mind. I was hoping that you would hear a little bit of Creole, but you can always, at the end, we can always do that just so I could get ahead. Okay, and so there's music You heard the one when you were coming in, Kassab, that's more popular, that's what everyone knows. But dissonance is a very different kind of music, very authentic, very different. Dances, everyone who knows anything about Guadeloupe knows it's la biguine. If you're familiar with Paris, you know everything is la biguine. But there's also very traditional music called Groka that is making a comeback. And they laugh at me about my pronunciation of Goka because it's G-W-O-K-A, and I'm supposed to say Woka, and I don't pronounce it very well. I say Goka. But that's making a comeback because they're really trying to get back to traditional practices, and one of them is revival of dances, festivals, carnival. Guadeloupe has a carnival like many places in the Caribbean, but its own, where they kill the king of carnival on the last day, and it's sort of putting an end to it, burying it, and going into Lent and then Easter and so forth, because it's probably 95% Catholic or more, very French. Okay, there are other festivals such as the Festival of Cooks. Every year in August you have the cooks who dress up in their traditional costumes and have lots of saucepans and spoons and everything hanging all over, you know, it's just their costumes, and they go through the streets dancing and making noise. These are all women. It's La Fête des Cuisinières. So that's another famous festival every annual in August. Their costumes, very colorful, etc. And I chose to talk about the madras because there you would find some of the influence from India, because this comes from, so you can see how everything has influenced everything else. Every single thing that you can find from Guadeloupe includes the madras. Everything, okay, from the placemats to head wraps to everything has the madras. Even the plastic bags that you buy, any little articles, they're all in madras. So it's very important contribution. And for me, my interpretation is that it's very symbolic of the whole Creole, the whole nature of the Creole culture. Because if you look at the madras, it has a little bit of everything. And although each madras is slightly different, yet they're the same in that it's just a mixture, and that is very symbolic of what the society is about and what Creole culture is about. Okay, current political and economic status. Okay, so we went from abolition of slavery, and but it continued to be a colony until 1946, when it became the overseas department that I mentioned before. In theory, okay, in theory, it's exactly like every other department in France, like the states in the United States. But there are some departments that are more equal than others, okay? And Guadeloupe is one of the less equal ones. The unemployment rate is so high compared to continental France that there were riots in 2009. People tried to make the government listen. That didn't make much of a difference. And so for some people, there's no relief in sight. There are the usual social problems, drugs, violence, seeping in more and more, okay? But why would France then keep on holding on to Guadeloupe? I can't remember who it was, but there was a very prominent politician a while ago. I don't know if my colleague, Monsieur Toumi, knows, who said, faisons de la Guadeloupe un paradis tropical. Let's make Guadeloupe a tropical paradise. That's what they want. It's the fun in the sun place. It's where you get away for cheap, I mean, from their perspective, because it's part of France. Vacation, and you just go down, have fun, and you leave the social problems, because they go to the beach areas, they don't deal with the regular people, and so it's just a tropical fun place to go to. So it still has value for France. Okay, society, I consider that Guadeloupe is a country within a country. Because culturally, it is a Caribbean island, therefore it shares a lot with the other islands. Okay, it shares a lot with Dominica, Haiti, and Martinique that are also Creolophone. They all Creole speakers. It shares a lot with Jamaica Now, you notice the influence of Rastas. There are Rastas in not very many, but it's really creeping in. The influence of reggae music on the rhythms and the evolution of the music in Guadeloupe. Now, for modern trends, they're really outward looking. As I say, making close contact with their exchanges, cultural exchanges. School children go on school trips to these other islands, etc. And there's what I call Obamania. One 7-year-old kid was convinced that I was really holding out on her because I wasn't admitting that I saw and had constant interaction with President Obama. She's 7. I tried to tell her. She thought that I didn't want to bring her here, so that's why, because she wanted to come back with me so she could meet President Obama. And I said, I'll bring you back, but I can't guarantee. She was not convinced. So you realize that for them, it's just this whole, because when they look at President Obama, they see someone that looks Creole, because of the mixture, and so they identify with him, and they're wonderful, and yet they say with a certain amount, the adults say with a certain amount of bitterness, ça se passera jamais en France. That would never happen in France. You would never have someone looking like President Obama as President of France. I won't get into the details of that. Okay, so to bring you to my research project, because time is running out, we all know the title. I want to tell you how this all came about. It was just a chance conversation I was having with a friend of mine. We were friends back in dinosaur times in the mid-1960s. Yes, there were people who were alive then. We used to have pen pals. That's how you entertain yourself. It was very exciting for me to go to the mailbox and get a letter with a different stamp. I collected stamps from all over the world. I had pen pals in Spain, in Tanganyika at that time, which no longer exists. It's now Tanzania, and so forth. I had pen pals from all over the world. That's how I spent my teenage years. And so one of my pen pals, who is now my friend after 40+ years, invited me to visit her in Guadeloupe. And so my first visit to Guadeloupe was in 1970. Last year, yes, 2010, I was talking with her, and of course, at our age, we're complaining about all the ways children change. And she was complaining about how terrible it is in Guadeloupe. The young kids, they know absolutely nothing. They're just into all this technology, and they're into sending SMS, which is text messaging, and so forth. And I was listening, thinking, very interesting. At the end of it, I said, well, we'd been planning our 40-year reunion. And I said, I think I see a project coming out of this. She, of course, thinks that there's something really wrong. And other people in Guadeloupe, too. A very old woman I tried to talk with kept saying, mais madame, pourquoi? She just wanted to know why I would come to Guadeloupe from America to talk about traditional games and toys. But for me, I'm passionate about this.